Bengals Director of Player Personnel Duke Tobin weighed in on the future for the Bengals stars down in Mobile. Let's break it down.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow. He's your host, James Rapien. We are Locked On Bengals, covering your team every day on the Locked On Podcast Network. We're on YouTube. We're everywhere you get your podcast. So if you're new to the show, you can hit that subscribe button to make sure you don't miss a thing, as we will have you covered this offseason with all things Bengals. And there is a whole lot to unpack from Duke Tobin's comments. As the everydayers know, we will dive into all of this stuff. And of course, we got to get started with the biggest stories coming out of Tobin's meeting with Kelsey Conway. Also has some comments on Bengals.com with Butch Hobson, Jeff Hobson. And there's a lot to get to, but it starts with Trey Hendrickson, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, the big contract questions for the Bengals star players in 2024, where there is some measure of question for each of those from a contract perspective this offseason.
Yeah, there is for sure. And they're in different situations, unique situations. I think it starts with Jamar Chase, right? If there was not that all three aren't got to have it, right? But as far as if there was one guy that you'd probably be focused on the most, it would be Jamar Chase. And Tobin telling Kelsey Conway of Cincinnati.com and the Enquirer, it's a priority for us. It's something we feel like there's a framework to work off of. Should be a pretty easy framework to work off of. Guys in his position have recently redone contracts. We believe in Jamar. I would expect that we could come together on something that makes sense for both sides. Not the whole comment there, most of it. I agree. They should have gotten it done last offseason. They didn't. It was a weird thing that bled into week one. But this is the one, like if you're most confident in one of them, to me, it would be the Jamar one. Obviously, it's the Joe tie, but it's also Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, all of these other star wide receivers got their extension after their fourth NFL season. Jamar is no different. Now, what's unique about it is he's coming off of a Triple Crown season. What's unique about it is he was the best offensive player in football, even if he won't win Offensive Player of the Year. And so, at least weapon-wise, he was. So, yeah, negotiations could get a little spicy, but I think the Bengals know that they have to pay him.
Yeah, I don't think this one is going to be terribly dramatic. It was dramatic last offseason. It bled into training camp, and there were issues all the way leading into week one. If that happens this year, we will be raking them over the coals for it. They cannot repeat that mistake this year. They should not have done that last year. They should have gotten it done last year. It was a bit more forgivable that it didn't get done last year because it follows the Justin Jefferson plan, and Justin Jefferson did handle it differently in Minnesota than Jamar handled it in Cincinnati. And it almost got across the finish line by all accounts. And there were issues over cash flow, was the reporting at the time. That seems very silly in retrospect. It was a mistake from the Bengals front office to not get this done last year. I don't think there's any way around that. But at this point, Tobin telling Jeff Hobson of Bengals.com, if he's the highest paid non-quarterback in the league, we accept that. So that is a man who's come to terms with what it will take to keep Jamar Chase, understanding the season that he's had, understanding that it is not last year anymore, and perhaps regretting. I don't know if he's regretting not getting it done last season. I imagine that you would have to, because due to inflation of the salary cap and the season that he had, I do think that the numbers go up a little bit. But like you said, he also said we know what it looks like, referring to the structure. That they did get very far in negotiations last year. So that shouldn't be the big obstacle for the Bengals this offseason.
No, it was basically done. It was a guaranteed money thing, and it was partially because of 6 years. It's hard. It's hard to be like, all right, well, on both sides to commit to 6 years. Jamar is obviously going to want a lot of guaranteed money over that 6 years if you're committing to that. Now it's 5. Now the precedent is there. And it's going to be a little bit more than Justin Jefferson. I don't think he's getting 10 million more per year than Justin Jefferson. So that's where it'll probably end up, whether it's a 4-year 150, 4-year 154, somewhere in that range. I've seen 4 for 160. I'm not sure he gets there. Maybe he does, but it's probably in that 150 to 160 range, which would make him the highest paid NFL receiver. No real doubts there. And I don't think people got frustrated on social media about the Jamar comments as much, but it was the other ones. And I think I think it's interesting regardless. And let's just pretend, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners and viewers have seen the comments, but if they didn't, the Trey Hendrickson one, I think certainly is the one we should hit next, because he's the guy of the 3. If you're ranking them, I think it would go Jamar, Trey, then T. And that's probably, if the Bengals had a board, where it would go priority list wise, not necessarily in order of what deals get done when. But Tobin was asked by Kelsey, do you plan on giving Trey Hendrickson an extension? And he said, you don't just give an extension, you have to agree to an extension. We would like to get Trey extended. Would we like to get Trey extended? Yes, he's an important player that played well for us. We can't have guys at the top of the payroll in every position. We'll do what we can. And then he went on and said, it's agreeing with somebody on an extension, not giving. So doubling down on that. He has earned a pay raise and a bump. He has, and we're cognizant of that. We will give that to him. But whether we agree on what that looks like is to be determined. My translation is they want to pay Trey. They don't want to make Trey the highest paid defensive end in the league. And hopefully that there's some middle ground there. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I think that there's some posturing from the Bengals here. I know a lot of Bengals fans were upset about the way Duke Tobin used language talking about this extension, saying that you can't, essentially they're reading that as Duke Tobin making excuses for it potentially eventually not getting done.
Mm-hmm.
Is how a lot of Bengals fans took those comments. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a couple things there. One, he's openly saying we know that he deserves more years and more money. Mm-hmm. And we're going to offer that to him. And he's trying to maintain some negotiating posture, knowing these comments will go public, and not give away all of your negotiating leverage through public comments before the negotiation has really gotten underway, and saying we're going to do whatever it takes to give Trey 2 extra years to make sure he's in Cincinnati. Like, mm-hmm. He's never going to say that, right? But people were upset about the language. Yeah, he shouldn't, because there is a game to it. Right. There is a leverage thing, and it doesn't necessarily dictate what's going on in negotiations, but he doesn't have any reason to have his comments thrown back in his face by an agent, or back in Katie Blackburn and Troy Blackburn's face by an agent and say, hey, look what your director of player personnel said in Mobile, Alabama. He's going to try to maintain some of that negotiating posture in his comments. Now, could he have said it in a different way? I think he was probably or apparently annoyed with the phrasing of the question, give an extension versus whatever he thinks, in acknowledging that that's not just a Bengals decision. Is his point there, is that there is a negotiation, and the Bengals love to emphasize this. Mm-hmm. And you're going to hear it again when it comes to T. Higgins. They love to emphasize this, but there's also this equally important acknowledgement that he deserves more money. He deserves more years. They would like to get that done. They will try to get that done. And again, if they don't get it done, they're in a different world and probably will deserve a ton of criticism depending on how they handle it.
And there's a leverage portion of this that I want to point out, because a lot of people are just going to say, same old cheap Bengals. Oh my God, you're not going to. And so I want to get to that. And I don't think it's pro Bengals. I think it's reality of the situation, and reality of where Trey is, and reality of what he's been over the past 4 years. So I'll share those thoughts. We'll continue. And obviously we have Duke Tobin's comments on T. Higgins as well coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by Gametime. Whether you're going to the big game, whether you're planning on going to 1, 2, 3, maybe 5 concerts this summer, Jake Liscow, probably a big concert guy. It doesn't matter. Any live event that you're looking to go to, whether it's NFL, whether it's NBA, whether it's opening day, which will be here soon. My goodness, the weather getting a little warm in Cincinnati. It's just a reminder that baseball's around the corner. You can get into all of your live events and take the guesswork out of getting tickets with Gametime. Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks. It's going to make getting tickets easier to your favorite event because it's going to cut out all the fluff. And instead of seeing all these tickets that you're not going to be interested in, it's going to show you the best deals, the best seats. So check out Gametime today. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, Locked On NFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Jake, the leverage part of this is unique. And this is why Duke isn't going to say, oh yeah, well, we have to keep Trey Hendrickson. He agreed to a 1-year extension last July, 2 Julys ago now, in July of 2023. That's this year's extension. And so the Bengals have gotten 2 different contracts done with his agent. He's under contract for this year. And they're saying, yeah, we want to give you a raise. We want to give you an extension. You've earned that. But why would you say, oh, we want to make you the highest paid? And that's what that was with the star comment. We can't have highest paid players at every single position. And so that's where I would probably be too, is we love you, Trey. We want to make you much more richer than you are currently. At the same time, let's find middle ground here. And Trey Hendrickson has 0. He better find the middle ground. I think that's where the Bengals, when you start to talk about the negotiations, you don't have leverage because your agent agreed to that 1-year extension. So find that middle ground and get that long-term deal done. This shouldn't be that. It shouldn't be that hard. It really shouldn't. I think this one should get done. I don't really know why it wouldn't, because it's not like Trey. He could do the trade route thing again. That would be silly, I feel like, because he blinked in like 10 minutes last year. And he's under contract. And the Bengals want to pay you more money and they want to extend you. And unless they're offering you $1 million more per year, they wouldn't do that, by the way, then it should get done.
Yeah, the concern here would be just their history with paying players on that side of 30. I think that's something that is in a lot of fans' minds. But like, that's not in Duke's comment specifically. Duke's comments specifically about this player, you read them earlier, are that he's earned a pay raise and an extension.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Would we like to get Trey extended? Yes. But whether we agree on what it looks like is to be determined. There's always that language from Duke, whether it's leverage or negotiating posture, just always loving to remind fans that it's a negotiation and it takes both sides. They've done it before with Trey. They got it done before. It was a 1-year deal then. If they try to go the 1-year route again, we'll trade bulk at that. We don't know. We don't know the specifics of what the Bengals' plan is here. And again, if they downgrade their defensive line because they blow this thing up somehow, that will be a problem. But we know based on this that there is very clearly a plan to negotiate an extension with Trey Hendrickson. It was also interesting to me, James, when you put this side by side with another Duke Tobin quote before we get to T. Higgins.
Sure.
He was asked earlier in the interview, where does retooling the defense start? And Tobin's quote in response to that question was, how many top guys at every position can you pay on a team? That's what we're going to have to decide. How much of that money gets funneled into the guys that really produce for us this year, which to me would suggest Trey Hendrickson, and away from guys that didn't. And those are the tough decisions. And here he's talking about reallocating money from underperforming players.
Yep.
And there are clear cuts coming. And he talked a lot about cuts throughout this interview.
Yep.
This is probably the first, maybe one of the first times he suggested it or implied it. And redirecting that money, right, to players who produce for us this year. Well, who produced for them on defense this year that is due for any kind of money reallocation? It's really just Trey Hendrickson.
One guy.
Right?
Yes.
Like
Yes.
Logan's still got multiple years on his deal. That would be the only other player in my mind. The other guys, there's no other extensions that you would really be thinking about this offseason. So it's Trey talking about reallocating money away from guys that didn't produce, two guys that did produce. So you throw that quote into the context too. And where do you distill the bottom line? It's very clearly that they think that I think that they value Trey and want to get more money to Trey Hendrickson. And then it's just a matter of whether they get it done the way they were able to get it done when they did the 1-year extension previously.
Yeah, I think it's a hell of a point by you, because this is why they should keep all of them. Spoiler, they should keep T too. There's no one to pay. They're paying their fifth best player in Orlando Brown Jr. and their best player in Joe Burrow, right? Jamar, T, well, it'd be Jamar, Trey, T in that order, 2 through 4, if I rank the top 5 Bengals. Why wouldn't you pay those guys? You have no one else to pay. Sam Hubbard, cut. Geno Stone, I would just cut him. Maybe keep him around. Sheldon Rankins has been cut for months. They just haven't officially done it yet. And there are a bunch of other guys. Like you could take half of Rankins' salary, half of that, and you put it into Trey, and that's it. Now it's done. And you do it for the next 3 years. This year, you give him a raise, and then the next 2. It probably lowers his cap hit this year, which is fun, because then you can move things around. Like it's a good point, because it explains the obvious vision that they should be in. Like in the past, I really think, like for Jesse Bates, I think they were so overwhelmed by the thought of Burrow and what that was going to be that it messed with them a little bit.
Which is not an excuse, by the way.
No,
like
I'm not making it an excuse. They should have kept Jesse Bates.
Yeah.
Okay. No doubt. I mean, because then you'd have
just
Hendrickson.
Making sure that listeners understand.
Yeah, it's one of those things where now you don't have what's lingering. Like, you know what Jamar looks like. He sounds pretty calm there. You know what it's going to be. You know what Jamar is. You just got to get it done. And in T, you have a pretty good idea. And in Trey, I think you've gotten 2 deals done with him. His agent's trying to get him more money, because I bet Trey is not happy with his agent for doing that 1-year extension. So give him some more money, smooth things over, and watch him go sack quarterbacks next year. I mean, in a 3-year deal shouldn't scare you, because he's playing at such a high level. Even if 2 of those years are really good and the third one's just okay, think about what you've paid Sam Hubbard the past 2 years and what you've gotten. Like, you can live with that with a star that is obviously a star.
And they've had a bargain there for a couple of years. They should continue to be trying to add players there, where if in that 3rd year he needs to be more of a rotational piece for whatever reason, and we'll see what the contract structure even looks like at that point, you would have the guys that have developed. And we'll talk about what he said about Myles Murphy another day. But it's not like it's just Trey in a vacuum the way that it has been. Like, they need to continue to get better in the defensive trenches. Duke Tobin talked about that as well. So it's not like it's just Trey and nothing. When you talk about 2-3 years in the future, that's another point that I wanted to throw in.
And how does this defense significantly improve with a disgruntled Trey Hendrickson, or with, let's just say you traded Trey Hendrickson? How do you significantly improve on defense? I think that's really hard to do.
It's possible, but really hard. Like, this would be going back to when they acquired Trey Hendrickson. This would be them zigging when we expect them to zag. The Carl Lawson, Trey Hendrickson decision at the time, and hitting on a bunch of decisions.
Yep.
And they have to hit on a bunch of decisions anyway. But when you lose your best player on the defense, it does make everything harder.
And there is a second best player, of course, but that second best player isn't in the same part of the building.
Anymore.
It's not even same room. It's not even in the same part of the building as Trey. Like, Joe and Jamar are in the same locker space. There's 2 lockers. They're right next to each other. Trey is his own corner of the building when you talk about defensive players. So, yeah, there's that as well. But we have T. Higgins to discuss as well. Can they pay all these guys? The answer is yes. Don't let anyone tell you they can't. Will they? We'll hear from Duke, or at least share Duke's comments coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is a one-stop shop for your daily fantasy needs. What does that mean? Well, all those season-long leagues, they're over in the NFL, but that doesn't mean with the big game looming that you can't get the PrizePicks right now and take advantage of all of the not only fun, but all of the potential winnings that you can rack up. And they have over 10 million members. That's 10 million and billions in winnings awarded. Maybe Duke Tobin and the Bengals should get on prize. I'm just kidding. They can't do that. NFL rules. The point is, though, the fun part of, I guess, fantasy, maybe regardless, you got to get to prize picks because it's super fun. All you're rolling with is player projections. So maybe you think that Travis Kelce is going to have more than his number of receptions or more than his number of receiving yards in the big game. Well, you combine that with either quarterback, because right now, if the quarterback throws for more than 1 yard, you're going to be able to get that right now. So Patrick Mahomes throws for 1 yard or Jalen Hurts throws for 1 yard, boom, that PrizePicks projection hits in the big game. So download the app and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game.
Before we get to T. Higgins, James, one last bit on the defensive side and the cuts, and this is something that we'll get into more on another day, but that quote that I mentioned about reallocating money continued. Mm-hmm. We're going to have to make some hard decisions as we move into next year, the dynamic of who is making it and who isn't, and where the young guys and the new guys fit. That's what they're going to have to decide. Talking about retooling the defense here. So obviously an understanding. And as we delve more into the rest of Duke Tobin's comments and the big takeaways, which we'll probably do in our next episode, it won't be today, there's a big emphasis on getting better on defense and finding the path forward there. And cuts are a big part of it this year. And Duke Tobin laying the groundwork for difficult decisions to be made. And one of those difficult decisions, James, like you mentioned, maybe shouldn't be that difficult, but for this Bengals front office certainly is keeping Jamar Chase and T. Higgins together. And he was asked by Kelsey Conway, what are the chances you'll be able to keep Jamar and T together? Duke Tobin said it's going to be hard. We feel like we have the resources to do it, but it all depends on how the negotiation goes and whether they're willing to accept wanting to come back at a number that makes sense for everyone. And you know what we do with T going forward. I've always been very upfront in my desire to have T. Higgins on my team. I've never not been upfront about it. And that desire continues, but we have to be able to come together with his representation on what that means and what the right number is for his experience, for his playtime, for his production, and find something that works for everyone, because it's a guy that we want to have here, and hopefully that can come together. But we have other guys who are trying to take big bites of the apple in other areas. We're going to have to balance those as we go forward. I can already hear the Bengals fans being triggered by the food analogy at the end of this quote. James, distill it for the people.
They want to keep T. And by the way, they better keep T. I'll set it out there. I'm going to say it everywhere, anywhere, all of the above. They're not paying anyone. This free agency class stinks. I can't give you 8 other receivers to go pay. I love receivers. I'm not going to say, oh, well, go get this guy and you'll be better off. Or pay Mike Gesicki and a Darius Slayton and you're better off than keeping T. You keep T because he's T and he's better than what you're going to get elsewhere. Anyways, I get the food analogy annoying people because it's pie. Now a bite out of the apple. I get it. T is also third in the priority list here. The Bengals will tell us all we need to know about their plans with T, with whether or not they franchise tag him. Because if you're T's agent, you're not taking a deal. You're trying to get the free agency. And obviously T switched agents. And I'll have a thought on that in a second. You're trying to get the free agency. He's going to get the most money if he becomes a free agent. If the Bengals truly want to keep T, they're probably going to have to franchise tag him. Because the moment you franchise tag him, it's kind of like Trey, where you can whine and moan and cry and throw all your hands up and demand a trade, but guess what? The leverage is the leverage, and the Bengals would have the leverage. And so that's when they could say, all right, let's get a long-term deal done now. Now that you know you're not going to become a free agent and be wined and dined by the Steelers and the Chargers and the Patriots and all these teams that are just salivating about the idea of getting T. Higgins, well, it's not happening. And so that would be the path. If they don't franchise tag T, he is gone. It's over. There's no chance he comes back because he'll get offered like 35 million. And then the Steelers will be like, oh, well, here's 36 or the Chargers or some team. It'll be getting into a bidding war, and the Bengals aren't going to win a bidding war. So I think the important thing about the Duke quote is the fact that he said, we believe we have the resources. I know you do, right? I think it's very clear. Like, I don't, there's no excuses here because they're not paying anyone else, and they're going to cut all these dudes to create even more cap and create cash and all of those things, or have the cash, not use it on those guys. So get it done. And I do think the reason this will take time is if I'm Rocky Arsenault, who represents Jamar and T, I'm telling T, we're not going to negotiate until we see this franchise tag window because we want to get the free agency. Now, if the Bengals go hard at T with an offer before the tag and say, hey, T, we don't want to tag you. We just want to get it done. Could he accept it? Maybe. I think he changed agents because he wants to stay in Cincinnati. He doesn't want to deal with the David Mulligetta. We're going to go here, then here, then here, and we're going to get you the highest paid, the most money. He wants to be in Cincinnati. And so it's up to the Bengals to make sure they get that done.
These big money receiver contracts almost exclusively, if not exclusively, happen with the team that drafts a player. They're not hitting free agency. And there are big, don't get me wrong, there are big wide receiver contracts given out in free agency to second-tier receivers. And teams generally regret those. If T makes it to free agency, he'd be the best wide receiver to make it to free agency in quite a while. All the reason that the Bengals should get it done, especially when you consider their other financial obligations this year. They're maybe going to have to overspend at a few other spots to try to patch some holes. And when you talk about the free agency class not being the best free agency class, it doesn't necessarily mean that the prices are going to be lower, because that's not how free agency works. The guys get paid market rates because that's who's available for these teams to try to get better. We'll see what the Bengals do here, because if I'm the Bengals, talking about the franchise window, James, I'm trying to, as a gesture of goodwill, negotiate as early as possible.
Which can be now. Can be right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And if T's worried about getting franchise tagged again, because that would be unpleasant for T. Higgins, I get that.
Sure.
I would, if I'm the Bengals, say, hey, let's avoid the franchise tag. Let's see if we can get this done before the franchise tag. See if that gets you a little bit of goodwill from T. Higgins. I also found it interesting, James, that the next question, or one of the next questions, Duke Tobin talked about his conversation with Joe Burrow. He talks about Joe every offseason, about the football team, tries to get feedback from him, give thoughts on what can and can't be done. And he said, we're normally on the same page. The next part of that quote is, and yes, it's easy to want T. Higgins back, said Duke Tobin. I want T. Higgins back too. It's all about finding a contract that works for both sides. And if we're really engaged with his representation of doing that, I think we can get it done. But if there's no engagement to get something done that makes sense, then it's going to be very difficult, and we'll have to see what other avenues we have. And this harkens back to Joe Burrow's comments throughout the late part of the season. T is a need. We want T back. We have a plan to get T back. That's Joe Burrow saying it versus Duke Tobin apparently reflecting on those comments from Joe Burrow, reflecting on his conversation with Joe Burrow going into the offseason and saying, finding a contract that works for both sides, and if we're engaged, we can get it done. But if there's no engagement, again, really doubling down on this negotiation angle. What are your thoughts there?
It's a shot at David Mulligetta. It's exactly what it is. There was no negotiations last year. None. Zero. I don't think there were many negotiations the year prior. I think the Bengals offered T, and it was low, and Mulligetta didn't offer back. And again, this is what I think. Pretty confident in. Mulligetta just called the negotiations there, and the Bengals they want to do the back and forth. Doesn't mean they aren't going to go up. Believe me, they knew. I'm pretty sure they knew that first offer to T wasn't getting it done. When you go buy a car, a lot of times the dealer's in one spot and you're in the other, and then you try to find middle ground. That's kind of how it works. in a lot of these negotiations, especially after year 3. I mean, I'm going back 2 years now. But my point is there was not much back and forth between David Mulugheta and who was representing T in the Bengals. I think Duke is trying to lay the groundwork, so hopefully that can happen with Rocky Arsenault. And if you do have that dialogue, then everything I said about the tag and not waiting and all that stuff, it kind of goes out the door. As long as Rocky's willing to negotiate now and T's willing to negotiate now, then there's no reason not to. And you have the blueprint for Jamar. I think for T, I think you make it clear, hey, we are going to tag you if we get that far. Let's avoid it and let's just get it done now. And I would start at like 4 for 100. And it might go a little higher than that. I know PFF projects him at 4 for 112. Okay, so I was $3 million off per year. If you're the Bengals, that cannot be the difference between saying, oh, well, we couldn't keep T-Joe and we could. Because they can, they should, they better. My expectations for this team are that they keep Jamar and sign him to a long-term deal this offseason, sign Trey to a long-term deal this offseason, and sign T as well. And maybe that's a 3-year deal with T, not a 4. Maybe it's a 3-year deal with Trey, which would make sense for the Bengals. Jamar, I would expect a 4. So we'll see, but that's kind of where the bar is with their current guys. And then after that, you figure the rest out.
And there's a lot of the rest to figure out because if they bring those guys back, those players were on the team this year that wasn't good enough. Yep. And I think that is we're too late in the show to get into that now. But
that's why you trim all the dead weight that Duke was talking about. You're so much better if you still have those guys, and then you have because you will have other resources, whether it's draft or cash cap, because you got to structure it right too to address those areas. It's not hard to upgrade from Rankins and Hubbard and some of those guys.
Again, I think there's an entire conversation here that starts for me in saying keeping those guys prevents you from getting worse at those spots. It does not make you better. It makes you better than the alternative, but it does not make you better than 2024 because there's so much other work to do. And so when we're talking about these apparent challenges to deal with all this money for these star players, just to get that baseline and give you something to build from throughout free agency, throughout the draft, throughout any potential trading transactions that may or may not happen. This is the baseline. And I think that is another topic that I would like to get to. We're not going to have time to do it today, but to me, that's the baseline of saying we're going to keep our core here so that we can build and get better.
Well, right now they don't have a core. Like if those guys leave, they have no core.
Right, but I'm saying if 2024 is a comparison, keeping those guys does not make you better. It's keeping the guys that were on your team in 2024. They need to do a whole lot of other work to get better.
No doubt. Like grab any defensive end in Mobile right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. My point is the bar is so low at some of these spots, but yes, they have to get it right in a bunch of areas. I just mean I will be disappointed in them which they don't care, but I will be if they don't keep these guys because it's going to be that much harder to be better if you don't have T or Trey's traded or Trey's pissed because you didn't pay him. That's all.
Yep. More to get to here with the Duke Tobin comments. We will continue to parse through these and bring you the most interesting tidbits and analysis as we try to parse Tobinese as Duke Tobin offered his comments to a couple of reporters, Kelsey Conway and Jeff Hobson down in Mobile, Alabama. That's probably coming to you next time on Locked On Bengals, pending other developments. Until then, thanks for listening. Hoo day, and have a good one.